Hello, let's take a few minutes and talk together about the protest movement in the reaction to the Vietnam War. Make sure you have your electronic note taker open and we'll fill this out together. So notice please there are three main questions on this note taker. Why was there such a large protest movement during the Vietnam War? What forms did the protest movement take? And were most Americans against the war? Let's start up at the top. Why was there such a large protest movement? First and foremost is an event that happens in January 1968. It stuns the American people. It's called the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive is named for that Vietnamese New Year, Tet. And during the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong, along with the North Vietnamese, launched a surprise attack on South Vietnam in the United States. This attack even included an attack against the American embassy, and it lasted about a month. And after this, the American people thought we could not win that war. It resulted in a tremendous amount of fear and shock among the American people. So support begins to drop. Second, because of that credibility gap that had been established, meaning that what we were hearing from the government seemed different from what we were viewing on television and learning about the war, there was a growing distrust of government. It became clear that the government was not always being fully honest with the American people. 1968 brought a lot of terrible changes to the culture here, the domestic culture, and that included the assassinations of Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and earlier on in 1963, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So we refer to this as the tumult of the era. Tumult meaning the difficult times. Politically, things are changing here. We have a new left or liberal group that begins to clash with officials. Primarily, the new left is made up of young students, people who are interested in social issues. So there's more political protest here in general. Many people had a belief that the war, any war, was immoral or wrong. Use of things like napalm, Agent Orange, that defoliant. Napalm is that like jellied gasoline, and the killing of civilians that was being communicated to the American people. Basically, many Americans just felt that this was wrong. And then the draft, the conscription of soldiers was a hot topic. And it was seen to be unequal. This inequality in the draft seemed to put more African Americans in the line of fire than what they represented truly in the population. So let's say today African Americans make up approximately 14% of our American population. That is true. And if it were disproportionate, that would mean more than 14% were drafted. So this was a point of contention. Also, some people could get deferrals either for college or other circumstances. And so this seemed to favor some people as being able to avoid the draft over others. So what did this protest movement look like? There were events called teach-ins. Teach-ins were basically people getting together and learning about things, about the impact of the war and the events of the war, and how the U.S. got involved. Marches. We've seen these before with Martin Luther King and his I Have a Dream speech. Marches were used in 1965. There were bombings and there was a call to have a march on Washington to protest. Rallies, big speeches, having people come and learn about issues, but also just hear speakers, including Martin Luther King Jr. Some people responded in protest with violence, retaliating against the government. Of course, people could get in legal trouble for doing this kind of thing. And then some people responded with the arts. There's a lot of protest music during this time. We call this a symbolic protest. Protest songs, flag burnings, those kinds of activities became more and more prevalent. And of course, most of this activity, except for the violence, is acceptable in the United States and protected as free speech. But the question is, were most Americans against the war? You're going to see that people were divided into what we call hawks. Hawks want to fight. They tend to favor war. And doves, which tend to avoid war, want to maintain peace. So there's a split politically in this view of how war should be treated in general. You still hear about hawks and doves today. Then we have a group called the silent majority. The silent majority are considered these mainstream most Americans who support the war. They don't necessarily like every detail of the war. They don't necessarily think the United States has handled every aspect correctly, but they're in support of it. They want to keep communism out of Vietnam. There are also some pro-war rallies. These rallies take place because people support the war by and large. And in fact, 70% of Americans think that protests against the war are really defeating the soldiers and not supporting the soldiers who are over there fighting. So most Americans do support the war, even if they don't support how the war itself and its events are handled by the United States. Thanks for taking notes with me today. We'll catch up again soon.